Welcome back to Season 4 of the How We Can Heal podcast. My name is Lisa Danylchuk, and I'm a psychotherapist specializing in trauma treatment. I created this podcast because I'm surrounded by people who have dedicated their lives to navigating healing. There is so much wisdom in each guest this season, and my hope is that this show makes their important ideas and experiences available to you in a way that uplifts and inspires you. These guests and I have committed our lives to fostering health and joy in the world, even as we work through the impacts of trauma and face deep challenges. Let's dive into Season 4 and let's keep talking about how we can heal. I want to give a big shout out and extend a huge thank you to the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation, the ISSTD, for sponsoring this episode. If you've been listening to this podcast for any amount of time, you've heard me talk about the ISSTD and the incredible researchers, clinicians, and advocates I've met during my time as a member and a volunteer there. This group is made up of some of the kindest, most inspiring, intelligent people, and I'm happy to be able to share just a few of them here on the show. This organization has been delving into the science and best practice of treating trauma and dissociation for over 40 years now, and they have a rich catalog of educational offerings for both professionals and non-professionals on their website. That's cfas.isst-d.org. If you're a mental health professional, I highly recommend you consider becoming a member of ISSTD. I'd love to see you during their live educational offerings and at the annual conference in Boston in March of 2025. Go to isst-d.org to learn more. Welcome back to the How We Can Heal podcast. Today, we are lucky to have Dr. Jennifer Gomez back on the show. Dr. Gomez is an assistant professor at Boston University and the author of The Cultural Betrayal of Black Women and Girls, a Black Feminist Approach to Healing from Sexual Abuse, published by the American Psychological Association. She's the creator of Cultural Betrayal Trauma Theory, which we talk about in Season 3, Episode 6, and she taught me the practice of dreamstorming, which we explored in Season 3, Episode 7. In this episode, she shares lessons from her book and the feedback she's received since it's been published. Today, we focus on the cultural betrayal trauma that happens too often to Black women and girls, particularly with regard to sexual abuse within the family. Dr. Gomez and I discuss next steps in healing that can help bridge the gap between the dynamics that perpetuate abuse and the dreamstorm of a safe, healthy world for Black women and girls. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jennifer Gomez back to the show. So welcome back to the show, Dr. Jennifer Gomez. I'm so pleased to have you here. You're so amazing and wonderful. Everyone who listens to the show already knows that because we had 2 episodes in a prior season where we talked about your theory of cultural betrayal trauma and we talked about dreamstorming. And as I was just saying, we can kind of start to fill in the blanks here. I mean, there's so much richness in between where we are, coming to terms with where we are and where we want to go in terms of a healthier society and a healthier space for all of us to live in and hopefully connect with each other in. So we can just go in that direction today, but just first of all, welcome. Thank you for being you. Thank you for being here. And I just so appreciate you sharing your time.
Yeah, I'm so tickled to be here. You mentioned that you'd want me back, and I was like, we'll see, but you did. So I'm happy to be here again.
No, seriously, I'll follow up. Oh, I'm not just saying. So can you start by just sharing, last time we spoke, your book was in the works and now it's here. It is, and it's touched so many people. And I'm sure you've gotten lots of questions and feedback and had more thoughts after it's come out. So what's it been like since it came out last year?
It's just a base level. Writing a book is really hard. So even just to have it be in print and everything else is just a wonderful, settling feeling. I think the biggest thing I've noticed is the people who talk to me about the connection that they have with it and how it resonates with them. And that feels really powerful because I stood really firmly in wanting this to be in it's an academic book, but to be in my voice, to be speaking very kind of bluntly and directly, and have emotion, like an emotional valence to the topics that are brought up. And so the fact that I can look at the book now and like myself, like for what is there, that I didn't compromise on the voice, and then have people say like, yes, it resonates the way that this was said or the way that words were put to this, is, I think, really, really nice and really rewarding.
Very rewarding. And it just makes me think of when I was doing yoga teacher training, I went back to the manual like the day before I had my practicum to teach, and all the language was different than what I had been teaching for years at that point. And I had a moment of thought of, oh, I have to say it the way it is in the manual. Like, let me bring up those words. And then I just had this like little spark of wisdom, of experience of like, when you do that, they're going to take points off because they didn't understand this instruction that you were trying to say in someone else's voice. And so I did it the way I taught the way I taught. And they were like, oh, wonderful, very clear. Like, there's something about being able to speak freely and in your own voice that's also very much a parallel process, I think, to a lot of your work, to be able to just call it like it is, say things without hesitation, without filter. So I love that that is your experience, because it is so much work to write a book, and you have constantly that you're trying to communicate something really valuable, something really deep, important, and nuanced. And so when you can just set it free, like, work through those moments of, are people going to receive it this way? Or how do I remember talking with you about that? Like, oh, this reviewer felt this way and that reviewer felt this way. And to be able to feel like it's authentic and true to you, I think is a huge win. So congratulations.
And the people who matter get it, and fortunately for me, it's been a lot of people. Like the book is selling fairly well, which is fantastic because, nobody reads anymore. So it's fantastic that the book is doing well, and people who are reading it are really enjoying it. And it's just, and there's things too I wrote that we didn't talk about last time, but I talk in the book about the option of leaving the Black family if there's this incest, there's sexual violence, etc. And I was very scared for how that would play on kind of all sides of, I don't want dominant culture folks to be like, the Black family is destructive and is, filled with violence, like all that stuff. And then it's not something that I grew up ever saying, that you can leave the family, like the Black family is a unit. So when I give talks and to share that piece and just be like, I hope it's okay. And having Black women in particular, multiple people say, I left my family, and nobody talks about it. Or I'm still in contact in this very boundaried way with this abusive male in my family. Or my child's not sexually abused by my father because I don't see him, and neither does my child, and nobody talks about it. So finally having this kind of like lifting the cloak of shame around that, and saying like, you can have loved ones, you can have a made family, you can be family oriented. And if the family that you are raised in is one that's abusive, you can choose something different and have that be on the table. So that being received well, I was very afraid. So that being largely received well and giving validation for folks and for Black women was really nice.
That's so powerful to get that feedback and to feel like your validating experience that does lift that cloak of shame. Because we talked last time about dissociation and how it's such a powerful, I was going to say healing tool, but protective tool, right? It's a very powerful protective tool. And when we start to lift that cloak of dissociation and or of shame, there's a lot going on under there. So it sounds like your book is really getting under the hood and allowing folks to connect with the truth, which is not always pretty, as we know, and not always enjoyable, and feel seen in that and feel supported in that, which is just so massive.
Yeah, but the truth can be difficult, but we suffer under the falsehoods. You know what I mean? So when we only frame that well, if we speak this out loud, it's going to be difficult. It is. But living within the silence and the invalidation and the kind of not double speak, but double personhood you have to do if you have to be around a Black male in the family who's abusive and everybody's, lifting that person up, condoning it, like what that does to you and your spirit, like that's also very painful, and it's like the act of disclosure and making those changes, I think is hard, but the being on the other side of it, there's so many people who are fortunate to have made to the other side to like a better life, and one that may not have been possible if you were still trapped in these toxic dynamics.
We had a guest this season, Britt Hartley. She talked about religious trauma and leaving a Mormon family, and just that sense of groundlessness that can come with that, but also freedom and authenticity that can come. She said, I would just become the thing, and the deep sense of freedom in saying what's true, and which we can struggle with, right? Whether we're talking about dissociation or we're just talking about living in a modern world. And like you talked about with your book, wanting to see, like, does this land? Do you understand? Do you get where I'm coming from? Does this resonate? Having those moments of like, I want to speak the truth here, but it's hard. It just makes me think of, we talked about the challenges, we talked about the Dreamstorm, and like, what are those little steps in between? And I think these are these huge steps in between of moments where we maybe take a risk, and sometimes we get a positive reception and sometimes we don't. But there's still something so valuable in acknowledging what's true in a way that we can also manage the impacts of that, right? Because I think especially with dissociation, there's this like, okay, we want to come back to a sense of pace, and we want to not try to do everything at once, which can also have its challenge. It can be challenging to stay paced, but there's something I think we're really grappling in the larger consciousness too, of like, how do we move forward from a place that feels challenging?
It makes me think of, to the extent that like other people mirror ourselves back to us, that if you're in a toxic relationship or one that's rife with this culture betrayal stuff and oppression, then what's getting mirrored back to you is something very negative, about yourself, that you're toxic or you're crazy or you're mentally unwell, or you're exaggerating or you're a liar, or you're a slut, or whatever these things are. And so it's like, when you're out of that and in other relationships, and you're mirrored back that like, oh, you're compassionate and you're kind and you're truthful and you're courageous. It's like, it helps to start to believe it, kind of this healing through relationships sort of flavor, that just feels so important and feels so much more possible than trying to like heal by yourself. And all you have are the people around you who are toxic, or if you're away from them but don't have them replaced, then you've become that perpetrator for yourself in your own head. You know what I mean? Where it's like, they're gone now, but I'll be mean to myself all day long, and twice on Sunday. You know what I mean? So it feels like being able to cultivate that space and be able to reclaim, in this case, like, what does a Black family mean when you come from one that's abusive? What does love mean? What does solidarity mean? What does loyalty mean? And how can those things actually be positive, and not used as a way to make it okay to abuse you?
It's a real untangling, right? It's like a real, it just feels like these things can get so stuck together. Of your definition of family is based on your relationships, based on your experience in family. If that has abuse, if that has exploitation, if that has toxicity, right? Like, and it can be such a process. I'm thinking about your work centers Black women and girls. I'm thinking about in your book, and the feedback you've gotten from your book, what comes to mind when you think of that process of, I mean, I think of it like differentiation in some ways, like that untangling between what's abusive and toxic and what's helpful and healing. Because that too, in my mind at least, is like those steps in between the dream where we're living world peace and abuse doesn't happen, or people seek support and help if they're inclined to abuse someone else. Like, there's less harm, there's no harm, we can go to that place. I feel like for the most part, we're not there yet. So when you think of that untangling and what you've seen in your work and your research and the stories you've heard, what comes to mind for you?
In I want to say the radical healing, yes, the radical healing in the Black community chapter, talk about Nakia, who's a Black woman who's in her late 30s. She's been sexually abused by her father, high school boyfriend, friended her first job when she was 18, like throughout her younger years into emerging adulthood. And she does this free write to kind of help herself get grounded and to be free. And in the free write, she doesn't talk about the abuse at all. She wrote it in fall 2020. She actually talks about, like, is there going to be an insurrection? There's racism and sexism everywhere. And I think in terms of like the detangling, it was the seeing, it felt like my interpretation of it, a cloak being lifted off of this discrimination, this abuse happens in these isolated spaces, as opposed to what she wrote is like the same thing I'm experiencing at work of racism and sexism is the same thing that makes it okay for police to kill and rape and beat Black women. And it's this kind of the same theme. And so with that can come a sense of clarity around what is harmful, what is not great, but not abuse, like all those things when you kind of like open up the spider web, of where things are.
It just makes me think of differentiating like violence and harm and like human error and care, right? Like I'm thinking of this layer of there's things that are really toxic and harmful, that are traumatic, that become normal in some systems. Like, oh, well, that just happens. That happened to my cousin. That happened to my brother. That happened to my sister. Like, it's just something we deal with.
Yeah.
Actually naming things sexual violence, actually naming things violence, like you've talked about, proving that rape is harmful. Like it makes my mind explode that you would even need to do that for anyone. But some people want proof or want research. I don't know. So going from that place of harmful things being normal, understanding how harm and violence impact human beings and bodies in general, knowing that care is so much more healing, connection, listening, support, right? Getting access to internal, external resources. And then there's in there somewhere, there's like, yeah, and we're not perfect as humans. In a relationship, you're in like a partnership, someone's gonna get mad and say something hurtful or harmful, and we can repair that, right? So again, I just feel like today we're in this like middle space of, okay, we know there's problems. And I think most people listening to this podcast, we can agree, we don't have to go through the research that it's harmful. We don't have to prove that again. Done, right? But like from where we are and from the harms that have already been done or continuing to be done, how do we like leave room for humanity and move in the direction of a dreamstorm of care, of peace, of connection, of support? And like, what does that dance look like?
It makes me think of, in terms of this like differentiation of like perfection can't happen, right? But like what's like a good hurt, or like this was a painful discussion, or this, or you hurt my feelings, I hurt your feelings, but we're not in like a toxic space, and how do I know that? And it makes me think of being able to kind of label out like what would be a good enough environment for me, and like, and how would I know that? And going back to yourself of like, okay, when I feel unsafe or whatever, I tend to start to self-harm. I tend to start to become a recluse. And so having those things that happen as a marker for what could be going on can be a starting point. And I like the frame a lot of like good enough environment, of like there's going to be arguments, but how do we repair through those? Is there repair? What would be necessary for me to get over it? What would an apology look like? A good apology, a decent apology versus, I'm sorry, or like being able to label those things. I'm sorry you felt that way, right? Oh, the worst. I'm sorry you took it that way. So I think being able to do those things on the front end and maybe consistently to know what you're in when you're in it, and be able to kind of commit to yourself to learning of like, I'm having this really strong reaction after this discussion. I think part of that is me, because part of past became really present, which isn't about you. And part of it is you. And then how I know the difference between those two things, I think can be helpful. I think in terms of like trying to walk through into like the reality that we have now, like into the dreamstorming, and how do we start to make movement towards that space? I think there's something I'm thinking of just the perseverance and the kind of insane belief that things can get better and that you can feel better. And I don't know if that sounds simple or not, but I know there's so many times with depression, with complex trauma, with all these things where it's like, but nothing will get better. And even if I can say this isn't all my fault, like we're in a society where there's racism and there's rape and there's, even if I can say that, but those things are still happening. So I'm still going to always feel this way or always struggle with this, like I think a space of like, these things are in some ways intractable and we're working towards changing them, but they're intractable. And there are so many spaces in between. And we talk about in the book, in the chapter on institutional courage, Shelley Carell and Lori Mackenzie Narusha's work on the small wins approach, and the idea that like you need to pay attention to what it sounds like to small wins. And so if this day was better than yesterday, then good. Then that's a small win. If I haven't smiled or laughed for 3 months and today was the day, then we have to notice that and celebrate that win. And then those days are going to become, more frequent, and those times more frequent, and the dark times, less deep and further apart from each other.
If you're listening to this podcast thinking, I want to learn more body-based tools to help support trauma recovery, then you might be the perfect candidate for the Yoga for Trauma online training program. This 8-week certification is for wellness providers and enthusiasts who want to learn the theory and best practices for providing yoga and somatic tools to those navigating the impacts of trauma. Students often come into the Yoga for Trauma online training program, or Y4T as it's come to be known, knowing at a deep level that mindful movement can help with trauma recovery, but not knowing precisely how to articulate it or share these tools with others. Y4T breaks it all down and leaves you feeling clear about your choices as you support folks navigating post-traumatic stress. Of course, the experience is good for you too. With 8 modules and 8 yoga classes, you'll get a taste of how it feels to practice yoga in a trauma-responsive manner. Head on over to howwecanheal.com/Y4T to apply and join the program today. Mention the podcast in your application for a special bonus. One more time, nice and slow. The website is howwecanheal.com/the letter Y, the number 4, and the letter T. Looking forward to seeing you there. I think this is a land of what, like, the people we surround ourselves with, like, we're all trying to figure this out. Like, how do we keep growing and improving and working through the truth of what's kind of in our hands and our bodies and our therapy rooms and showing up in research? Like, how do we really sift through this in an honest and authentic and integrated way where we're not dissociating and we're not ignoring things, right? Because that's like a la 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 la. Okay, but it takes energy and it's not real, right? So like, how do we actually continue to address these things? I'm wondering if that framework you brought up last time of who was harmed, what are their needs, and whose obligations is it to meet those needs? Is that a direction that you feel like kind of brings this together? What we're talking about here is I'm trying to like land, like, for people listening, like, what do we do with cultural betrayal trauma? And if you're listening and you're like, what's cultural betrayal trauma? go back and listen to the first interview, which was so rich, and explains it very well. Go, if you can, and if you're inclined, get Jennifer's book and, read the articles she's written, go to her website, and fill in that blank. Because I think like where I want to go today is a little just more that daily practice and the small wins. Yes. Looking for momentum, I think of a lot. Which direction are we going? Like, can we keep orienting in a way that does feel like there's some hope there? That's what I was hearing as you were describing. Like, there's some hope for things to get better. There's possibility for things to improve. There are days where I think a lot of us are like, oh man, this is never going to change. And it's a lot. I think when we're talking about trauma, when we're talking about dissociation, when we're talking about cultural betrayal, when we're talking about trying to find institutional courage as a organization or a group of people, it's like, man, I just could barely even agree on what word to use in this paper, or I could barely decide what to have for dinner with my partner, and we love each other together. So do you feel like it's helpful, the who was harmed, what are their needs?
So what you're pulling from is restorative justice, which is comes from indigenous practices, and then has been slowly but surely making its way more into academic spaces, and even into universities. I would argue that getting closer to the indigenous roots is a nice place to be, and not distorting it. It can be distorted in terms of like restorative justice means mediation. So then you and the person who harmed you sit and talk, and then everything's better. Actually, like not where it comes from. But so who was harmed? What are their needs, and whose responsibility are those needs? And so let's say we have Black father who sexually abused Black daughter, which I talk about a fair amount in the cultural betrayal of Black women and girls. So who was harmed? So daughter was. We can also extend this to everybody who father lied to about this, who was gaslit by this. That could be mother, that could be siblings, that could be nieces, uncles, cousins, whoever. So who is harmed is the central person here as a Black girl, but it's also the harm is not just her. What are the needs for her, for daughter, and then for other people around her who were harmed, and whose responsibility are those needs? So responsibility would be father, as well as other family members who were supposed to be protecting daughter. And so when we're thinking about this, and we're thinking about, okay, like that's, who was harmed, what are their needs, and whose responsibility are those needs, how do you put this into practice? I think two ways can help us. And one is, or both of them are, having higher expectations regarding people who do harm perpetrators, and higher expectations for so-called bystanders. And so what does that mean? You have a Black father who sexually abused Black daughter, and you have a wedding in the family. And both people are invited. Everyone knows at this point what's happened. And the message is to daughter, we understand if you can't go, but you're obviously welcome to come. We don't want to choose sides. In a different world, we could expect that Black father says, since I sexually abused my daughter, I'm going to not go because that would be uncomfortable for my daughter, and I want her to be able to have this experience with the family. So given that this was me who did this, I'm going to exit out, and I'm going to ask none of you blame daughter for that, since this was my responsibility.
Yeah.
We could have a world in which that was the expectation,
yes,
that is what you would do. And the expectation that if we're thinking about kind of transformative ways of how do we heal all of us, including father who wasn't birthed out of nowhere, like he may very well have had his own oppression, abuse, all these different things. So if we're thinking about it in a transformative way, to not just discard father, now father's a demon and so he's no longer a part of us, period, end of story, which could be a way that we go and could be a reasonable way if fathers don't want to change. But if we're thinking about transforming of like, okay, if we can hold him accountable while holding him as human, then what can that look like? He doesn't need to be deemed a demon or a one-dimensional child rapist. And that's the responsibility not of daughter, I would argue, but of the people around. She can hate him as much as she wants to. And the people around and the justice system can say like, okay, so he's a full human being. He's a complex person. He's done these really horrible things. And what responsibility does he have to make amends for those things? And saying that I did do this as a matter of fact, and not doing the Darbo response from Jennifer Fry, the deny, attack, reverse victim and offender. But no, I did do this. This means that now family functions are awkward. And so I'm going to take the hit for that, so that she can make sure to go, et cetera, et cetera. Do you know what I'm saying? So, and for so-called bystanders of the locus of like who did the harm, let's say, yes, it was father, of course. Mother also knew. Mother knew, mother saw the physical signs, and she did nothing. When daughter disclosed, she then said, I don't believe you. I'm going to go ahead and stay with father. There's an accountability that needs to happen, that could happen and could expand us beyond the dialectic or the kind of two sides of the non-offending caregiver mother, or it's all mom's fault and father's never responsible for his own behavior. Like there's a more complicated place in between in lots of these cases where it's like, yes, she's not responsible for his behavior, and we need to be careful to not take that sexist frame. And in cases where she did know and did nothing, we can also complicate this out. What's her abuse history? What were the decisions that she made? What were her constraints in her marriage, et cetera, et cetera? And she perpetrated harm by not believing daughter, by not protecting daughter, and having accountability for that, having relational repair around that of, I couldn't hear it then. I'm sorry, I can hear it now. And I have ideas for how I want to repair this relationship, and I want to hear your ideas if you're willing to do that with me, because I'm sorry that I wasn't in a place to do this, and I deliberately made decisions and disparage your reputation and all these different things. You know what I'm saying? Like it's shocking to me how little we expect from people who perpetrate horrible harms, and from people who knew about the horrible harms and didn't do anything. And that we expect so little and assume that an apology will never come. The apology may or may not come, but it's sort of like how I think about teaching. I'm a professor, and so I have expectations up to here for my students. Whether students reach those or not, I can't fully control that, right? I can do my best to bridge the gap, but I'm not going to start with my expectations down here and say, well, they might not meet them, and so I'm going to teach and hopefully get a C in my class, an average. No, I'm going to teach as if you want to master this material and really, really learn. That's where I'm going to start. I wonder what the world would look like if we started from that place with people who perpetrate this horrible violence, and to, again, be able to have there's a rhyme, there's a reason behind this perpetration, blah, 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 blah. And here's our strategies to make amends. And if you don't do that, then there are consequences for doing that, but you have an opportunity for a road forward. And when you don't take that, then there's going to be accountability in other ways then, and protection of people if you remain unsafe to be around, etc. But for me, that's, in thinking about like iteratively what steps we could take, I just would love to see us focus in that direction. And even thinking about like child sexual abuse prevention, I'm all for psychoed for children and for understanding body parts, et cetera, et cetera. And a child's a child. Like that there has to be an expectation that adults don't sexually abuse children, and expectation that any prevention strategies we're using, if the people who perpetrate are most often close others, then we can't tell a child, tell a trusted other. That could be the person who's perpetrating. So I think having and holding the reality of the depth of the problem can help us find different solutions. I think when I'm in spaces and having discussions like this, a lot of times we discuss things as if people who perpetrate are kind of bad apples and not a vast majority of people. And not probably in this room, probably in this space also. And if we thought, oh, they're probably, and really is, our former president of the United States. We've got 2 sexual harassers on the Supreme Court. And then think about your workplace, university, think about clinicians. We know clinicians sexually abuse clients. Like, if you really like peel back the onion of how many people are we talking about who do this, then our strategies would have to, by definition, change. And if we then extend that to, okay, but it's that many people, how many people know about it and don't do anything? Okay, now you've gone out to even more people. Yeah, Lisa.
I just love that what you're speaking to is this transformation in our collective expectations of each other, right? Of the silence around these issues, of the, well, I'm not going to say anything. Yeah, it's kind of awkward about the wedding, but it's really her choice if she wants to come or not. No, like, there's so many ways that people who have been the recipients, the victims of abuse, then carry the weight of so many more decisions and implications.
Yes.
And if, as a larger culture and group, however we define that group, we can change the expectation. Like, that's where I feel like there's some things happening in the world right now where we're just trying really hard to like shift, and maybe it'll click at some point where we're like, no, like, that's not her responsibility. And in the group, the family, the families that are a part of the wedding, and everyone who's a part of planning that, there's just an expectation of, no, that's up to the father in this case, the person who perpetuated the abuse, to step out, because we don't, I don't know a lot of places where we have that expectation now. There might be quiet conversations between a few people and back and forths and sort of secretive loops of how are we going to deal with this thing, but there isn't a collective awareness of how much abuse there is, and I don't see a normalized sense of, oh, okay, well, the responsibility falls on the person who perpetuated the abuse and on the group to support the person who was the victim of the abuse. Like, that's what I hear in just even the wedding example. And it's like, how refreshing would that be? And that feels like, yeah, we can talk about world peace. We can talk about abuse never happening. Love it. Let's go. Feels really far away from my perspective right now. I can think of people who abused their children, fathers, mothers who abused their children, who then learned it was very harmful, who have made efforts to make amends, who have, grown and changed and feel very, very bad, like feel the guilt of what they've done and see the impact intergenerationally of what they've done. So like, if I've seen that happen in my lifetime and in their lifetimes, I feel like it's possible for there to be a wedding where this is the scenario and someone goes, hey, people in general, the group holds that expectation of, this isn't hers to decide if she wants to opt in or out because it might feel awkward for her. The person who perpetuated the abuse is actually the responsibility here. I feel like I don't know if you have any examples where you've seen that happen yet. I don't personally, but I think we could get there. Like, I feel like that's maybe.
So I've never seen it. Doesn't mean it hasn't happened. I haven't seen it, but I'm with you. Let's just like speak it into existence. I think it absolutely can happen. And I think in the example I gave, the premise was that he was this kind of parent you're talking about, that he's apologized, you know what I mean? In cases where that's not true, and he's still being abusive, he's still doing these things, then it also, there's like a weird we don't want it to be our business, or it wasn't my daughter it happened to. If it was my daughter, then I would make sure that he wasn't around, but it was a more distant relative. And so in that case, like, I feel for you, but I have my own relationship with this person who remains very abusive. And so I'm going to go ahead and privilege my own relationship, and it's like, yes, but that's sort of irrelevant, right? Because the love that you have for your child who was not abused, just because you don't love distant relative as your child, doesn't mean distant relative isn't deserving of that same love. And in this example, her parents didn't give her that by definition, right? By being sexually abusive and all these things. And so she doesn't have that umbrella of protection, but she still deserves it. And so if we're thinking, well, I would do it for my daughter, but I won't do it for a distant relative, why is that if the harm was the same? Then it should be that the standards are the same. That if you think your daughter is worthy of this protection, if you can empathize with if this was your daughter, what it would feel like for her to be around this person, then certainly someone who's not your daughter also matters just as much, even though you don't love her as much and you don't have a mother-daughter relationship with her or whatever. You know what I mean? Like, it feels to me like the answers to these questions are closer than we think. Like, there's a logic to make here of like, if I wouldn't want it for my daughter, then it shouldn't happen for this other person who's not my daughter. We can make those links and then start to kind of like tap at that cognitive dissonance. You know what I mean? Or like promote that kind of like, then why is it different though?
Yeah.
Why is it acceptable if he remains abusive to not hold him accountable and to kind of not take a side, quote unquote, by very clearly taking a side.
And it's the secrecy and the silence that make it so, I think, so entrenched in terms of where I see where we are right now. It feels like that's one of the biggest hurdles is oh, it's not my business, right? Yeah. Oh, it's a cousin and I've only met them a few times and I don't know the full story. And that's always true. Like, we never know the full story. But if we're confident or pretty clear that something happened and harm was done, how do we advocate for people to whom the done as a group, as a collective, and how do we step out of those shadows of the secrecy and the shame? And I just think of, Brene Brown talks about, and I'm sure other people too, of the secrecy, like that shame can't survive being met with empathy. And you were just talking about that empathy of, well, the empathy for your child. So can we use those steps of, well, I wouldn't want it to happen to me. I wouldn't want it to happen to my loved ones. Well, this is another loved one. Maybe they're a cousin that's twice removed or whatever, but they're still a loved one. So there's something too, you were talking about the definition of family, of extending that empathy into the family and being willing to, especially if you feel it internally, oh, that's uncomfortable, oh, that's unfair, that's unjust, speak something out that's true for you of, is anyone looking at the list or the seating chart, or is anyone talking to different people in the family to try to clear the air about this ahead of time? That takes a lot of risk and vulnerability. And I think it's easy from the bystander standpoint to just, I'm going to lean away because this is a really gnarly subject. Right?
Yeah. But it makes me think about like the empathy that you were speaking of also, I think, requires, and this is maybe where people get tripped up, or part of it is that you have to then see the depravity.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, you have to remain present. You have to not dissociate. You have to remain that this person who was always kind to you is actually this person who is a father who was horrid and abusive to his daughter. And both of those things are true. He has good qualities and your relationship was a good one. And he also has done all the other things. And I think that like, I think we get it more as a student clinician, you're practicing of like that holding that people have good and evil inside of them, like, the depravity of people, but that is, that's a toughie, to be able to really see that. And it's sort of I don't know if it's an adage, but like, everybody's against rape unless it's someone who's close to them. And if that person rapes and it's like, oh, maybe it wasn't really rape, or oh, maybe it was a misunderstanding, or maybe it was, we're all against it until we're faced with a person who's like, no, but they don't have two horns and they're not a demon. But they did, in fact, rape somebody. And Nicole Badair's work, you can kind of see it on the wrong side is her book that just is coming out about universities' handling of sexual violence. Brilliant book. But her work, she's interviewed people who have raped, men who have raped, and it is not a confusion. It is I didn't rape her. She was saying no, and I kept going. But, and it's like, yes, you know what you did here. And we could, again, we could have, I believe that we can have a difference with this kind of like, I don't know if it's a paradigm shift, but certainly like a shift in focus of who are we looking to solve this problem, to solve like the wedding problem, who are we looking for Mel Tucker, who was a coach at Michigan State, sexually harassed Brenda Tracy, big national advocate. She's a white woman, he's a Black man. And I was talking to people about this and I was like, he should apologize. And people were like, he's never going to do that, and he certainly did say, made allusions to this was racist, that he was being held accountable in ways that are predictable. And it was like, yes, because we don't believe he will apologize does not mean we should not expect it. And have that is what should happen, though. He should say, yes, it happened. And it was an abuse of power, and it was depraved in these ways, and I am sorry. Mm-hmm. And if you don't want to do that, maybe we can't force you, but we could say that's where we're sitting. So if you want to join us here, then you can apologize for this. And if you want to stay where you sit, then you can stay.
Yes. It's just like you were talking about being a professor and having students come in. And if someone comes in and their first paper is a C, you don't go, oh, okay, well, you're just going to get C's then.
Yeah.
Right? And that makes so much sense. I'm sure most people would agree. Oh no, if a teacher's going to support them or help them or hold the high bar, get some resources, get some tutoring, hope for this, aim for that. And there is something where I feel like there's a sort of acquiescence or acceptance or what's the word I'm looking for? It's not even surrender. It's like giving up, like a hopelessness.
And complacent and just kind of like an accepted, all these words of just, but he's not going to do it. And so you have to do it. But why? Yeah. Why is that okay?
Yeah.
That we, anyways. Yeah, I think what it makes me think of, Lisa, is like, if this were the case, if we were successful in making this cultural shift to where we focused on prevention, on people being responsible for not perpetrating, and that was the prevention. And if we focused on, okay, who owns the sexual assault? The person who did it, not the person it was done to. Like if we made these shifts, then how much closer could we get to actually having the Dreamstormed world of no sexual violence, no oppression, like all these different things. Like if that's what we were actually expecting from people, I feel like we can get there closer sooner, and have more of those small wins where it's not every family, but it's some families. Yeah. It's families we've heard of more now. You know what I mean? Like where it just is proliferating out.
And there's models, right? And there's models in media, in movies, in stories of, oh, well, this can happen and people can be held accountable, and where we see it and it's not so secret and it's the norms start to shift. I just had this thought as you were talking of, wow, what if an entire profession here develops? Because when I think of the people I know who are therapists, 99+% of them work with victims of abuse and harm and trauma. I know some work with perpetrators. It's a small percentage. It's probably 1%. I could probably, fill a room with 100 people I know who do the work and be like, there's the one, there's the one over there who works with perpetrators. Refer, right? Get them in every system, please. But if that person and that percentage grew to where there were a whole field of folks who were, okay, we're going to set the standards here. We're going to work with these with this problem from this side. And I know you and I both know people who are criminologists and psychologists and researchers who have that perspective, but it still feels like a sideline thing. And I think the more people, even individually in families, come to terms with abuse that's happened, and the silence and the even dissociation that's there sort of sloughs off to some, that makes it easier for that larger cultural shift to take place where, okay, let's get some healing for this person who is really nice to me and really awful to his daughter. And that there are places and spaces for that aren't so like, oh, I know this one over here. Like, I know this one restorative justice place, or I know this one wonderful clinician. That's how it feels from my vantage point right now, where people are doing that work, but it's just not so centralized and common. And along with that shift, I think there's just like people are so much more open to talking about trauma now, right? It's like, can we have a shift of the general expectations of folks who have harmed are higher, right?
Yeah. And I think I agree completely. And I think where I'm sitting is similar to you, where it's very, very few. And I can speak for myself in my own work. Years ago, my early trauma research was looking at like mediators for victimization. So why was child sexual abuse victimization linked with later re-victimization? What are those kind of victim factors in the middle? That's the wrong place to look, right? Because I think what that does, at least for me, I can speak for me, where I was coming from, was like, I don't want people to be sexually abused anymore. And so if we can figure out what they can do to not be sexually abused, then that's empowering. Like, I think that's where I was coming from. I want this to stop. And I have no expectation that the people who do the sexual abuse will stop. So then I have to look over here to the people who are victimized.
Yeah.
It's so for myself, it's the wrong place to look. It is inherently victim blaming. By definition. And I think it ignores the power or the veracity of rape, that if we could stop it, rape wouldn't exist, right? Rape is what you don't want to have happen. If we could just like defend our way out of it or whatever, then it wouldn't exist. So the fact that it does exist, it means that it's not this person's fault. What if instead our lens was, when Black father sexually abuses Black daughter, then we could research how there might be a passing along of either directly with sex trafficking or indirectly to other people who perpetrate in the family, friends of the family outside, who they all collectively then target this one daughter, and not other siblings, but this one person. What's happening for people who perpetrate that seek out certain qualities? How do certain things get identifiable? Or is it a matter of, we'll try with different people? Is it a matter of chance? Is it a matter of proximity? Like, all of that work that I feel has been done minimally, I don't want to erase work, has been looked at a little bit, but it is absolutely not of the same volume, the same anything as the other side. Like, if we really said, it is the perpetrator's responsibility to not do this.
Yes.
Why is we're talking in this gendered way because of the culture portrayed Black women and girls, but why is he continuing to do this? How is this promoted? How is this okay in the environment? What excuses are the rest of us making? What excuses is he making? Wow, would we have different answers that would actually then matter for change, since it's never the victim's fault? If that's true, then we can't keep looking at her.
Yes.
For solutions.
Applause, hallelujah. Yes. Okay. And I also feel like our conversation today is, for me, and maybe it's because I'm a sleep deprived parent now, but it feels like cognitively harder because we're like trying to find this middle ground, right? Where it's not just identifying the problem, not just identifying solution path, like it's the middle of where does that rubber really meet the road? How does this look in current time, in current life, in current challenging moments and communities and groups, and these moments where someone is hosting a wedding and they do know there's sexual abuse in the family, I'm sure there's someone listening who's like, oh yeah, I was planned a wedding and I knew that there was someone who abused someone, and how did my family deal with that, right? Like, we know the numbers. It's
Yeah.
so prevalent. And so I think these conversations are so important, and I'm so grateful for you and all your work. And we didn't even talk about liberation health framework at all yet. But you've got a talk coming up at ISSTD about that. Tell us where you're speaking next so folks can follow you and keep learning from you.
Oh my goodness. For a few places, but for ISSTD, it's the regional conference in DC. Yikes. I'm sure you can put in the date somewhere. I have no idea. October 26th.
Yes. October 26th. Lovely.
Yeah. So that'll be wonderful. And be talking about all of this stuff and relational cultural therapy, liberation health framework, institutional courage and change. How do we change the world, per usual?
Shout outs to Jennifer Fried, always on for that. And then so we just had Lauren LeBois from McLean on the podcast too, and she mentioned the DID conference happening at Harvard, the inaugural DID conference. So are you speaking at that one? Is that?
Yes, the Harvard McLean.
Yes. Okay. And that's in September. So that's coming out end of this month. Yeah.
Yes.
Wonderful. And I know it's going to be virtual, so folks can join from anywhere. I also saw Bethany Brand on the docket there. So, and she's been on the
fantastic roster.
Oh, I know.
It's amazing what they've pulled together.
I was so happy to see it. I just like, I don't know why my brain thinks in emojis these days. I'm just like, celebration emojis, celebration
like the bam bam, like the
party popper emoji, party popper emoji. If I could add that to the registration page, I would, but I'm not in charge here. So I'm really grateful for everyone who's doing this work, for everything you've contributed, for everything that went into your book. I know there's so much that goes into sitting down and writing and crafting and recrafting and communicating these powerful ideas, and so much background too, in terms of, history and research and how it all builds. So I just really want to celebrate you today. And I think we're going to have to schedule 2 hours for our next podcast. So we've caught up to episode 3, and now we've got at least 9 more.
Yeah. So respect you and everything that you're doing with this podcast and beyond, and just honored to be able to be a part of it and to share space again with you, Lisa.
Are you working on any articles, books, or anything now that we can look out for?
Oh, always. I actually have a new publication with Robin Gobin. It's Gomez and Gobin in Journal of Trauma and Dissociation. We asked Black women survivors about what they thought of cultural betrayal trauma theory. So that is published now. So go check it out.
Okay, great. And your book is The Cultural Betrayal of Black Women and Girls, a Black Feminist Approach to Healing from Sexual Abuse, published by the American Psychological Association. Those folks watching on video, you can see it up on the shelf there, and you can get it pretty much everywhere, right? It's American Psychological Association. It's probably available on all the places folks buy books online and stores.
Yeah, many places that books are stored, but books are sold. Yes.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa.
Thanks so much for listening. My hope is that you walk away from these episodes feeling supported and like you have a place to come to find the hope and inspiration you need to take your next small step forward. For more information and resources, please visit howwecanheal.com. There, you'll find tons of helpful resources and the show notes for each show. Thanks for your messages, feedback, and ideas about the podcast. I love hearing from you, and I so appreciate your support. There are lots of ways you can support the show, and I'm grateful for every little bit of love you share. If you love the show, please leave us a review on Apple, Spotify, Audible, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can always visit howwecanheal.com/podcast to share your thoughts and ideas as well. Before we wrap, I want to be clear that this podcast isn't offering any prescriptions. It's not advice or any kind of diagnosis. Your decisions are in your hands, and we encourage you to consult with any healthcare professionals you may need to support you through your unique path of healing. In addition, everyone's opinion on this show is their own, and opinions can change, right? Guests share their thoughts, not that of the host or sponsors. I'd also like to send just huge thanks to our guest today, to Kyle Arizbal of Prolific Sound Solutions, and to everyone who helps support this podcast directly and indirectly. Alex, thanks for taking care of the babe and the fur babies while I record. Lastly, I'd like to give a shout out to my big brother, Matt, who passed away in 2002. He wrote this music, and it makes my heart so happy to share it with you here.